Tuesday, June 29th. Hello and welcome everyone to part 2 of our 2021 garden tour. In part 1, we looked at all the cucurbits that we're growing. Cucurbits are your pumpkins, squashes, melons, cucumbers, watermelons, loofahs, gourds, and the like. In part 2, in today's walking tour, we're going to be looking at the tomato plant, which is a member of the nightshade family. Other members include peppers, eggplants, and potatoes, and we'll probably be looking at those in future tours. Today we'll be talking about tomatoes, the different varieties that we're growing, where we're growing them on our property, how we're growing them, and talking a little bit about how they're doing. We're located just east of downtown Los Angeles in an urban lot, and we have our tomatoes placed around our property because of the way our property is influenced by structures and the landscape and the geography. We have a slope that's to our left, and it has a big influence on the amount of sunlight that we get. In this particular spot, we do not get sunlight until noon, and what's nice is that the sun will be on these plants until sunset. So this is normally a very good microclimate to be growing some of the larger producing varieties like the San Marzano. However, this year, for some reason, our plants are making fruit that are a little bit smaller. So as we go and head towards the wall over there, I do want to note that over there that we have an interesting microclimate where we get sunlight that peers right through between the second story house that is our neighbor's house and our single story house, and we get a good amount of sun from the morning time, and it gets a little bit of shade because of the slope, but after the couple hours of shade we get sunlight in that little sliver until sunset. And before we head over there, I want to quickly note that our San Marzano are being grown single stem, and we grow them pretty closely to one another, and while it looks like a multi-stem plant, it is actually a bunch of single stem plants. Here we have a multi-stem plant, and it's being grown inside this tomato cage that was provided to us by Gardener Supply for product testing. And the Black Prince tomato is a good plant or variety to grow multi-stem because it produces medium-sized tomatoes. When we grow multi-stem, we will use this method for smaller varieties and medium-sized varieties. And if we use it on larger size varieties, like the ones that get over a pound, we're going to get smaller tomatoes, but we're going to get more of them. So with the Black Prince, it's a good tomato to grow in a multi-stem situation. Next to the Black Prince tomato, we have this tomato that is called a Patio Delight. This plant was provided or is provided to us by Burpee, and we're doing a trial for them. This is a variety that will be available for purchase by the consumer in 2022, and it makes what appears to be smaller size tomatoes, so we'll be excited to see how they taste when they're ripened and ready to go. Over here we have some more San Marzano, and these once again are being grown single stem, and we have a couple of lateral growth that are towards the top that we allowed to grow, so we didn't sucker them. And this year we're starting to see them ripen at their usual time, which is late June, but they're not making fruit that is as long as they typically are in previous years, and that's something to be expected with anything that you grow. Some years are better for certain things than others, and it looks like the San Marzano is taking a break this year, so next year we should expect some nice San Marzanos. As we head down to the junk drawer of our property, we're going to be looking at this Cherokee Purple tomato that we're growing in this cooler microclimate. And in Southern California, what happens is all the different types of tomatoes will stop producing once it gets warm. So if the plants don't have tomatoes, or I should say if tomatoes aren't already on the plants, we're not going to be seeing additional fruit sets because the pollen is not going to be viable. And what happens is the tomato growing year ends pretty much around now. So we're hoping that by growing in this cooler microclimate, maybe we'll see that this Cherokee Purple tomato will continue to produce fruit for us. In cooler climates, indeterminate vines like this Cherokee Purple will produce all summer long for you, but the drawback is you're probably not getting tomatoes until later in the year. And in Southern California, all tomatoes, whether they're pole, bush, indeterminate, determinate, they all behave like bush tomatoes, they're determinate tomatoes, and they make one big giant crop really quickly, and it's over. Over here we have the Roma tomato, and it is the only determinate type of tomato that we grow. It's a very dependable, practical cooking tomato, and we planted, or I should say, we sowed the seeds very early, and we wanted to see how early we can get cooking tomatoes, and these were started in January. And in this setup, we have some rather good size Romas to harvest, and we are getting them around mid-June. And if you're wondering about this window screen, we're using it to protect the fruit from the ducks that might want to eat them. And there they are right there. They have access to the yard, and they like to snack on ripe tomatoes if they can get their bills on them. Over here, we're going to be walking by and looking at another tomato that we're growing for the early harvest, and this is the Principe Borghese tomato. It's an indeterminate type of plant, and it makes these rather large cherry size tomatoes, and this one is ripening and has tomatoes in mid-June. And in early March and April, we'll see one or actually a few tomatoes that we can harvest, and we can use them in the kitchen. And it doesn't take much for flavoring. Sometimes you can add one or two tomatoes, and it just adds a nice flavor to a soup or a rice dish. So it's nice to grow that one for the early harvest. And over here we have a couple of Costoluto Genovese tomatoes. These are cooking tomatoes, and what I like about them is that some of the fruit make these fluted shapes, and it's fun to find them. But most of the times they're flat, round tomatoes, and they are small to medium size. They're a good tomato. They're nice and flavorful and not overly tart, so they're good for cooking, and they're also pretty meaty. So we're going to be looking to growing those some more and giving them a little bit more love than those two plants that we had. As we come back to the 150 square foot garden, we're going to be looking at this tomato, which is the beefsteak tomato. They make 1 pound tomatoes, and we're going for size in this setup. So we're growing it single stem, and there is a fruit that's forming. This is a younger plant compared to the other tomato plants we have, and it is one that was requested by a gardener in Big Bear. Big Bear is a climate or a region and city in Southern California, the mountain areas, and they have a cooler climate, and their tomato season doesn't start until much later. So these were timed for them, and we kept a couple of plants for ourselves to grow a tomato and to refresh our seed stock. We haven't grown this variety in a long time, and I like to grow from relatively newer seeds, and so we're going to collect those seeds and refresh our stock. In this back corner area here, we have another Black Prince tomato, and it makes some really dark tomatoes, and this is a setup to illustrate how you can grow tomatoes in Southern California with minimal effort. You can put a plant down and not worry about removing suckers or worry about training it. Here it happened to have grown onto the wattled trellis, and it is growing underneath our peach tree here. There's not a lot of sunlight, but it's still able to make fruit. If there's ample sunlight, the fruit will be a little bit larger. And we'll see in a second another plant where we're growing in a laissez-faire, hands-off manner, and it is the Golden Jubilee tomato, and it doesn't have a trellis nearby to provide it support, so it just flops over on the ground and has spread out. And in this scenario, you can also grow tomatoes as well, and we have a green tomato that is going to ripen for us. Ideally, you want to have a lot of sunlight, at least 3 to 4 hours. In this canopy, underneath the canopy of the mulberry and the other fruit trees, it gets probably 3 hours at most, but it's able to produce nonetheless. In this container, we had another Golden Jubilee planted in here, and we allowed 3 leads, and it produced a nice tomato, but the plant didn't do so well, and I think it might have been because we planted some fenugreek around it and near it, so it might have affected the plant, and we removed it after harvesting. Here in this bed, which is the ideal planting spot for tomatoes, and we get morning sun and a little bit of afternoon sun. By 3 o'clock, it gets a shade from the house, but nonetheless, there is enough light and important light that it produces large fruits for us. And in this bed, we have 4 plants of the new to us variety called the Blue Beach. It's an heirloom variety, and this is what it looks like in its photos. And what we've discovered that it has some interesting variants to it. Instead of looking long and slender, there are some that look like an ox heart tomato, and this one has a tapered end. The plant next to it is producing one that looks like an ox heart tomato. And then we'll see over down here, we have one that is a little bit between an ox heart and a blue beach. So it's been a very interesting tomato to grow. And what has been a big surprise is how big these tomatoes are growing. And I wonder if this is an old cross between the San Marzano and the ox heart tomato, because they look very similar. Sometimes the San Marzano grows and has a tapered end and looks a little bit like what this blue beach is looking. And even on the blue beach plant, some of the fruits look like San Marzanos. And later on, we'll be looking at some ox heart tomatoes, so keep that in mind when we're looking at this blue beach tomato. Here we have a Cherokee purple tomato that's growing in this planter. We received this planter from Gardener Supply to do a product test, and it is a self-watering container. I'm not a big fan of self-watering containers because of where we live. Here in Southern California, the Asian mosquitoes are very, very prevalent, and any type of standing still water, they will breed in, and they are a real terror. So what happened with this container is I went and drilled holes on the bottom of it, and it's no longer a self-watering container. And I want to make note of that if you're looking at this container and you're wondering about it. The other thing is that because of the way the container is set up, you have to use a specific soil medium, and it's mostly peat moss. So it grows more in a hydroponic setting, and we're going to be curious to know how the tomato tastes compared to a tomato that we grow with some native soil as the soil for it. Here is another planting of the Principe Borghese tomato, and it is in an area where it doesn't get as much sunlight as the tomatoes over there, so the size is not as big. And we are making note of which microclimates will grow better tomatoes for us. And that's something that, as a tomato grower in your backyard or in your area, it's important to trial out some different spaces. Trial out the number of sunlight that you get in a particular spot and see how that plant responds. So as we move to the front yard, we're passing by the glass gem corn, and then we'll be passing by some pumpkin plants over here, or I should say winter melons. And then we're going to be looking at a couple of varieties that are growing here. This is a new to us variety. It's a German type of cherry tomato, and I cannot remember the name, so I'll be sure to be putting it on the screen. And this is one that we've had seeds for the longest time, and we're finally growing it. It looks like the Principe Borghese tomato, but it doesn't have a very pronounced nipple on it. The Principe Borghese has a very, very sharp nipple, and this one is nice and round. And then over here we have more Roma tomatoes that we're growing, and we sowed these at our normal Roma tomato sowing, so we don't have any fruit that are ripened, unlike the earlier ones that we saw. And furthermore, this is a newer tomato growing area and a newer growing area in general, so the soil is still developing, and we're starting to see that the soil hasn't fully developed because the tomatoes are not as big as they can be. Underneath all the foliage, we are supporting the plants with a structure that we made with sunflower stalks. So we have a horizontal stalk that is braced by a couple of by a brace that's made from crossing two sunflower stalks that we kept in place by a twig that we use as a peg. So that's working out well so far. And then our final tomato variety is the Oxheart tomato that we're growing in the Porch area. And this is my favorite type of paste tomato to grow because it's very practical and it produces fruit that is over a pound in size. Here we're not going to see that this year in our Oxheart because the area where we're planting, this Porch area, doesn't get sunlight until 3 p.m. And when it does get sunlight, it gets it till sunset. So with a large tomato like an Oxheart, you're going to want to give it as much sunlight as possible. But nonetheless, we're able to get Oxheart tomatoes. If we didn't use this spot, then we won't be able to grow this. So we're very grateful for what we're getting. In addition, the plants are going to provide the house a little bit of a break from the summer heat. The plants are being used as a shade structure. And what's nice is that the vines in the back, which are the hops vines, they are actually growing and grabbing the tomato plants to hold them in place. So with our tomato plants and the shade structure, we're getting two things out of it. We're getting cooling, and then we're also getting some fruit out of it. And we're going to be looking at up here where you can see the hops vine holding back the stem from flopping over. So that's a nice thing to have going on. And down below, we have some pepper plants here. And in the next part, we'll be looking at all the different type of pepper plants. And this could be our sneak peek for part 3. And here we have some Himo Togarashi pepper plants. And they make these long, slender peppers. And then planted in front of it are some ahi pequino, otherwise known as beak peppers. And they are a very interesting pepper to grow and something to talk more about in part 3. And that's going to conclude part 2 of our walking tour today. I hope you had a good time checking out all our tomato plants that we're growing. And until part 3, thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.